I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. There is no meaningful difference between a wild animal and one that is domesticated. Wild animals feel the same pain that pets and humans do. Suffering is equal and the feelings of abandonment exist to the same capacity. We do have an obligation to wild animals. If anything, the exclusive care and priority we put specifically on pets and domesticated animals is itself immoral and goes against the obligations we have towards our community and nature. 2 points of setup. Firstly, why can't they argue more obligation under their comparative? Firstly, it's the capacity for suffering is oftentimes the same. That obligation is based on things that suffering is the same extent, and therefore means that if it's based on suffering, that obligation is equal. Secondly, even if you believe a higher obligation, the difference is capacity. You have the same capacity regardless on either side to be able to care for animals to the same extent. It's the capacity to care and alleviate their suffering the same. Putting down dogs or cats, caring for them. And the analogy for this is important. Often you don't obligate a poor person to do things like donate without the capacity, which presumes that there needs to be an equal moral level of capacity in order for you to assume a broad similarity in terms of their obligation. Secondly, what is the actual human obligation that we have? Firstly, to pets, we question it. It's that the harm to pet exists and it's liable for it. It's things like animal endangerment that is often seen as a crime, or even if not that, it's socially looked down on in most communities around the world. It's the acknowledgement and prevention of harm in the first place, like people not supporting crossbreeders for things like pugs or other types of dog breeds that in instances that they are things that destroy the diversity of genetics that exists within these things or harm the ability for dogs to live. But secondly, that you also support positive metrics towards which you can treat these animals better. It is bettering their conditions, more space, being able to provide laws insofar as you're able to protect not only these animals, but even in instances where they are like things like stray dogs or whatnot, at the very least be able to care for them and provide some level of allegiance from the government. First argument. Why is there no moral difference between these two animals? The first mechanism we explained is that they feel pain and suffering to the same extent. The thought experiment for this is clear. The feelings that we think are often intrinsic to humans also exist with animals. There's a lot of empirical data to prove this. In fact, we've seen that things like calves that are abandoned by their mom often make the same noise that a cow mom makes when they've lost their children. That is to say that on either side, these animals feel to some extent the same amount of suffering, regardless of what types of abandonment we feel are intrinsic towards humans. Why is this broadly important? Two things. Firstly, it's that we try to prevent suffering at all costs based on our own human morality and obligation towards communities. Oftentimes, we are adverse to suffering because we understand it's universal. We don't want to apply these feelings of pain towards different individuals, which itself also applies to animals when we ourselves understand that they can experience it to the same extent, if not more. It's why we crack down on things like crime. It's why we try and do things like alleviate poverty or make sure that people aren't hungry, precisely because we understand that the universal experience of suffering is itself immoral and it itself needs something that needs to be mitigated. Secondly, that our convenience also holds less weight than suffering. That is, that it is important that even if we experience some conveniences, often the prerequisites to mitigating suffering or completely preventing it are most important. The intuition of this is that a lot of laws that exist in status quo aren't based on positive correlations or obligations that we have. They're often based on preventing negative correlations. It's things like you don't force donation from individuals, but that you stop stealing in terms of you wanting to reduce suffering by the end of this. I'll take it later. Secondly, that connection and ownership by itself is an arbitrary metric, which is why oftentimes this is a bad metric to which we oppose or describe our moral obligation to these animals. Firstly, the only difference with pets is that they're domesticated. They are genetically the same. Oftentimes they go through the same experiences. Often they have the same culture or ways in which they live. And in those instances, they are basically the same as domesticated pets. Secondly, they don't consent to the birth lottery. There's no agency from these animals. Your obligation to a random pet on the street could have been to any other pet at any other time or variation of the world. And that by effect means that because pets themselves cannot arbitrarily be decided on or specifically be decided on by some broad fate, the importance of this is that your obligation should be to all animals rather than to a specific animal that was randomly assigned to you. But three, that it's vulnerability. These animals are particularly vulnerable. It is chickens, I'll take you later, crammed in coops. It is pigs in pigsties that are extremely dirty, that are often subject to the same force of treatment or same form of treatment within their places. They often have no agencies, are only subjected to these instances, which is why the preemptive obligation needs to be within humans to upscale these things and make them generally better. But secondly, they might say that domesticated equals captivity. The difference is that these people are hunted. It's that these wild animals are destroyed. The biodiversity and natural cause of life are often destroyed precisely because we fail to hold them in captivity. If it is a world in which they are abused, in the world in which they have less rights, oftentimes we'd explain that obligation itself is to be able to protect them, especially in these instances. What is the weighing for this? It is that the existing metrics we have to prioritize pets itself is unfair and should not be the meaningful basis through which we're we're able to derive some specific obligation towards specific sets of animals in comparison to others. But secondly, what this proves to you is why it's faulty. You cannot specifically put a premium on any specific animal, and that's important because this allows you from treating them equally well or equally good. POI.
How exactly do you plan on alleviating the suffering of wild animals? Like, what are you actually proposing to do concretely? And do farm animals count as wild animals on your side?
Cool. Second argument, capacity. What do we explain and why are you actually able to handle and, well, better the lives of these animals? Firstly, it's why you have capacity, right? Firstly, it's supply and demand. You are actively the ones that are controlling things like overconsumption or overproduction. Even things like which businesses and corporations and practices are often the ones that are handled. Whether or not slaughterhouses are as inhumane as possible, or whether or not you can actually do things like fight against governments and make sure these things are more transparent. It is eating less meat that equals less overproduction. That empirically right now, with the stronger veganist movement and oftentimes more prioritization towards nature and things like wholesale foods, oftentimes have reduced have had recent frequency in slaughterhouses closing in recent times. Secondly, you also have direct ability to do things like donate to NGOs, things like PETA, veganism movement, that oftentimes mean and imply that you have equal capacity even if you couldn't directly save these animals in status quo. But thirdly, I want to note the contention in this. Directness and indirectness often doesn't matter in this debate. It's whether or not it leads to indirect or direct incomes don't matter. What matters is that the obligation itself is upheld. It's more about taking a reasonable response to problems. Like the intuition is we don't have to fly to Africa and solve world hunger in order to fulfill our obligation to make the world better. It's why we have an obligation equally to do things like donate, to do things like indirect actions itself. That often means that even indirectness and the capacity for these are equally important. It's that some people are not being capacitated themselves also does not diminish obligation. It's refugees, it's the poor, it's the environment, that many times we often can't help them, but the importance is that it is hard and we still have an obligation to try and directly help these things. What is the counterfactual that we explained then? Firstly, it is that oftentimes we're able to coalesce better movements in order to capacitate not only betterment of the obligations that we're able to live, but also in general changing the structures in which we're able to do things like combat overproduction or even things like the care for animals. But secondly, it is that we don't pick and choose. Oftentimes it is equally applied across all animals, and that itself is important. If we want to apply equal standards, equal moral obligations, where the inconsistency itself is often immoral because you give preferences towards individuals, which if we believe that poverty and richness is bad, that itself is immoral. All these reasons, propose.
Thanks much. Speech leader home.
Here's a weird angle, mate. Oh, that's better. Wait, now my double chin can be seen. Okay, never mind, cut out. Okay? Government cannot take a soft stance and get away in this debate. Because on opposition, we believe that our obligations towards animals exist insofar as it benefits us. So, as human beings. Now, the stuff that they talk about in terms of how they're going to protect wild animals, like veganism movement, for example, doesn't actually fulfill the obligation of alleviating suffering of all animals. For the simple reason that it's symmetric. We can support veganism on our side of the house because farming cows, for example, contributes towards climate change. We can conserve some animals on our side of the house insofar as it benefits us from biodiversity and tourism. Gov's obligation, if you create an obligation to alleviate suffering, it has to be an obligation that goes beyond the selfish interests of human beings to support animals. They must defend ways in which human beings are protecting animals, even if it doesn't benefit us, especially even if it actually comes at the cost of human beings, and therefore doing so in a selfish way. That is the additional level of conservation they need to support on their side of the house. Three things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about where do human obligations come from. Second, I'm going to talk about what does alleviating the suffering of wild animals actually look like and why that's problematic. And third, I'm going to explain why pets are a much easier obligation to fulfill and therefore why we should have that. First, where do obligations come from? Because presumably, the fulfilling the obligation towards wild animals is presumably done centralized through the state, right? Where the state allocates resources towards alleviating the suffering of wild animals. The problem, however, is that firstly, we believe states have a greatest obligation towards human beings because human beings voted in the state, and as a part of being a part of the state, you gave up your rights and privileges in return for state's protection and in return for the state prioritizing you. Animals, on the other hand, have not given up any such rights and therefore do not deserve the same privileges and cannot be prioritized over humans. Secondly, sentience. Human beings have a greater capacity to feel pain, and more importantly, the greater sentience mean they crave things like dignity, which often is the prerequisite for us to live any kind of life. That's why we prioritize obligation towards human self-preservation, because that is the prerequisite for you to exercise any other rights, but also the prerequisite for you to be able to fulfill any other obligation. That's why, for example, we support eating animals at the point which the nutrition is important for us to exercise any of our other rights, and we don't stop that. This has to then factor into their claim about how your capacity to fulfill the obligation will determine the extent of the obligation. Because if you think about it, in reality, there is capacity to actually protect wild animals. The problem is, insofar as resources are limited, money put towards that is money that you take away that you could have otherwise used to protect humans. So the money exists. The question is, how do you make those trade-offs, and is it a valid trade-off to make? So they cannot run away from it by saying we have no capacity. There is capacity. It's just how you allocate those obligations at the point which the capacity exists. Because notice that protecting wild animals is extremely expensive and it often comes at the cost of humans, which means recognizing this as an obligation necessarily hurts human beings. Because what we're going to explain throughout this speech is that, firstly, the cost of alleviating the suffering of wild animals is way too high to justify that trade-off, but the cost of alleviating the suffering of pets is low enough that we can do so. Why then do we care about alleviating the suffering of pets? It's because it actually makes us happy. The fact is, with human beings, when you have pets, you have proximity, you have emotional attachments to pets, and you get happy by the fact that your pets are healthy, which means that's a cost that you're willing to bear, and it's a cost that's small enough often that doesn't actually massively detract from our ability to actually help human beings. That's why we think the difference exists. Second argument then, what does the actual suffering of wild animals look like? And this is important. Firstly, a vast majority of suffering that wild animals go through is just natural, right? Like, as a result of food chains where deers are mauled and eaten by lions. It's a result of environment where they die of hunger and thirst as a result of droughts, or suffer as a result of heat waves and cold sprouts. It's a result of natural injury when they fall off cliffs, for example, and then bleed out and die. This is a vast majority of suffering that actual animals go through that they need to protect from. But even if you're talking about things like poaching, for example, this is probably the minority of situations insofar as you can only poach the animals you have access to that exist in areas around settlements, but also we have laws that protect against this because we have an interest in doing so for conservation reasons. What then does it actually look like to protect and alleviate the suffering of wild animals? And we think this is actually massively disruptive, right? This looks like, for example, proactively identifying animals that are suffering, which means you need to go into forests, send forest rangers into forests to identify these animals and bring them out so you can then stitch them up and take them to hospital, which means you're destroying habitats in the process. It means bringing the animals and just institutionalizing them in zoos so you can protect them from the environment, which massively deprives them of their actual ability. It means supporting and protecting invasive species, which are also wild animals, which hurts the ecological balance and destroys ecosystems as a result. This is the extent to which they need to protect animals in a way it doesn't benefit humans. Before moving on to the cost, yes?
So when we think we have a moral obligation to refugees, does that literally mean we kill ourselves to benefit refugees, or that we do something to help them?
So that's the point, right? We don't say we have an absolute moral obligation towards refugees, which is why we allow states to decide when they want to take in refugees. It's why we don't force poor countries to take in refugees at the point where they don't have the capacity, but recognizing it as an absolute moral obligation would force them to accede to that. Let's talk then about the cost of actually alleviating the suffering of wild animals. First is just monetarily, right? The fact that you would need to stop eating meat, for example. The fact that you would need to, for example, alleviate the suffering of animals that have been mauled, that are bleeding out in forests, means that you would need to provide things like healthcare, providing food to animals that are suffering from things like droughts, for example. And the process of finding animals that are suffering is massively costly. This is a cost that could have, opportunity cost of money that could have otherwise gone to things like healthcare, education, welfare, to protect the most vulnerable individuals. Secondly, it's an extreme level of conservation, which ultimately harms the poorest individuals. The poorest people who need the access to the land because they can't live in cities, who are going to lose their housing as a result of needing to protect the forests in order to protect the wild animals. It's people who lose access to the agricultural land as a result of mass conservation. So the point here is that the process of fulfilling that obligation ultimately hurts the most vulnerable people that the state has obligation to protect. Why then do we have an obligation towards pets? The reason is because it's just a much easier obligation to fulfill. There are fewer threats that pets face, right? Insofar as there are no actual predators, they live in a controlled environment, they're proximate, so it's easy to identify when they have been harmed, to actually go and alleviate their harm. The point of all of this is to explain that the reason why we have an obligation towards pets is not because pets are somehow morally superior, but it's just because pets make us happy. And we have that obligation to ourselves to be happy, to be fulfilled, because it is through that happiness that we actually live meaningful and fulfilling lives. Insofar as the right to life is only meaningful as a human being, insofar as you have a quality of life, you have an obligation to pursue happiness. And having a pet is one way by which you fulfill that obligation. So therefore, protecting your pet benefits you. Protecting a distant wild animal has no such benefit and often comes at the cost of protecting human life and human happiness. Therefore, there is no obligation. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech, DPM.
Okay, I'll just click this. Right?
I think it's still
It's
recording.
running.
Oh, okay, sorry. Alright, starting in 3, 2, 1. I will first deal with this claim that moral obligation means that humans should absolutely compromise and kill themselves and somehow make all magical radical changes, and this is what moral obligation means. 1. This obviously, to your own social intuition and to our literal own philosophy, does not make sense. When we think we have a moral obligation to, for example, refugees, people generally agree. We have that moral obligation. But obviously, this moral obligation is within reasonable extent. We do not obviously say that people should, for example, endanger themselves in order to benefit these individuals. Because again, moral obligation is not inherently a qualitative thing. It's just about a reasonable attempt to take an action to benefit that particular person who is suffering. Secondly, the extent to which we believe we also have a moral obligation to pets implies that we still also cater to moral obligation of humans. Note, this exists on both sides, and their side is not the only side that can say we have a moral obligation to humans. Guess what, guys? Obviously, humans still need to exist and still need to thrive in order to help both wild animals and pets. It's unclear why we have to compromise on human existence or human civilization or general social acceptance. Like obviously, if we took all massive changes to somehow promote veganism, then this would be backlashed on and reversed obviously a lot of the change we could do to benefit these individuals and also would be worse for humans overall. But thirdly, again, moral obligation can actually be reasonably met. And this is the core clash in this debate. Their clash is that we cannot meet it. We explain from Zen to no response from them that we can. What are the ways in which we do, or what are the ways in which they explain they can't meet it? 1. They say there is so much natural suffering in the environment, we can't alleviate it. 1. We explain we can do something to alleviate it, and in fact we can increase the amount of things that they do. They literally say conservation, we can improve those through wildlife agencies, through NGOs, through general supporting of the UNDP and all of that in developing countries. Secondly, food chains. They say these things will exist. 1. Does not apply from moral obligation that somehow these things do not at all exist, but rather we have a reasonable attempt to solving them, like being more humane. Like for example, lessening slaughterhouses that obviously hurt a bunch of individuals on the ground. Thirdly, they say mass land loss. 1, a lot of the time these are already conservatories. It's unclear why this is a change in the motion. But 2, in our worst case, if we have to conserve more land, that is good. Because a lot of the time on their side of the house, they often prioritize extensive human greed that often is worse for humans and also worse for all kinds of animals in the future when they massively industrialize. This is a problem that we're willing to take literally in our worst case. If they want to say morals and humans always, all the time, here are reasons why humans and the prioritization of human moral obligation is not good. 1, or is not good solely. 1, human moral obligation is less on their side because again, humans are not the ones that suffer the most. They have less ability to experience the direct suffering that animals, especially wild animals, suffer. 2, often these human moral obligations are selfish. Again, their side literally is saying, just prioritize whatever benefits you. And guess what? Within our understanding of philosophy motions and obligations, selfishness is bad because obviously it confers less value to people who have equal capacity for suffering on their side of the house. So they had to defend why the selfish utilitarian, not even utilitarian because they don't even prove an actual concrete benefit for humanity on their side, as to why that's the only moral framework we can take. we gave you actual reasons as to why we can meet this moral obligation in a reasonable way. Because I explained earlier, it doesn't have to be unreasonable to have a moral obligation, just that we take an attempt to do so. One, obviously a lot of people can participate in indirect ways of helping these wild animals. Like wildlife NGOs exist online, you can donate to them. A lot of the time, most people can indeed access these things. And we explained from Zen to no response to the previous speaker, there is no practical or pragmatic or principled distinction between these two things.
What?
Two, obviously you can increase the current situation in which it exists. Again, I want to be clear. Our side is not to defend immediately reversing the situation of all wild animals. Rather that we have an obligation to try. Their side of the house has the implication that they are lesser, always, all the time, which by effect means that they will not try on their side of the house to do these things. Lastly, on obligation to pets, on obligation to wild animals. Obviously, right, economies of scale, generally speaking, networks that are larger, obviously means that we can efficiently do these things on our side, especially given that there's a diversity of different sources of different funding, NGOs, aid networks, clinics, veterinary clinics, ability for you to reach out into these things as well. But fourthly, I would genuinely contest the average person cannot in fact help wild animals. You can go to a protest. You can elect a person that actually can care about wild animals more and lessen inhumane slaughtering. You can in fact talk about these things online that overall confers your moral obligation to lessen their suffering. I am genuinely unclear then, and here's the actual burden you had to take, why you cannot and should not do any of these things on their side, because by nature they are saying you have a lesser obligation to these individuals. At the point of this, I explained why moral obligation exists also on our side. I would argue that it also exists, especially even if humans are selfish, we should still do it. PY.
If there was no cost to protecting wild animals, human beings would have just done so anyway for selfish reasons. You need to explain, therefore, why there's an obligation we need to create to coerce people into doing this, which means you also need to consider there's some cost involved that we need to be okay
Like, this is nonsense logic. Obviously, humans are in fact already doing a lot of things to help these animals. We would prefer they do it more, right? Like, they literally say conservatories, they literally say NGOs, they literally say wildlife agencies. Their side had to defend why we had to strip these things, lessen the priority of these things for the benefit of pets, which, by the way, there's a resource asymmetry on both sides. We have to prioritize one or the other. They say we prioritize pets more, there's a lesser priority for wild animals. At the end of this, what should you care about? Firstly, moral obligation is about capacity for suffering. And again, they have not disproven this analysis from Zen, which is why it still wins. They are equally capable. And note, regardless of the difficulty of humans to meet this obligation, there's still an animal on the other side that suffers, that moral obligation should still exist and is not deleted by difficulty. We do not think that we do not have an obligation to refugees because it's hard to help them. Obviously, we still do. That's why it still exists. Two, the distinction between pets and your ability to enjoy them is arbitrary. The birth lottery for animals also exists. Your enjoyment for these things also are arbitrary. Thus, on weighing, you have to defer to what is certain. And what is certain in this debate is that these animals, wild and pets, have equal capacity for suffering, equal ability to exist in this world as either a pet or wild animal, and thus you have the benefit of certainty and thus the ability for you to say that, importantly, moral systems should be consistent, and because we believe that they should be consistent, they apply more on our side. This case has no solvency in this debate. It is not an important case. For those reasons then, propose.
Thanks for that speech, Diego.
No, sorry, give me a second.
this team ignores their burden. It is not about doing more, as they claim. It is about obligation on the same level as pets, as we claimed from first. And I want to start off this speech by illustrating just what we do to pets to alleviate their suffering. We bring them to vets when they're suffering. We scrutinize their health every day. We control their diet. We care for them when they seem to be in trouble. Will we extend this obligation to every single wild animal in a way that is of the same level, which is non-discriminatory under their side? They have not engaged with this comparative. What we told you from the start fundamentally is what an obligation is. It is a socially coercive force that pushes you to do something against your self-interest. They claim that it doesn't exist for refugees, but it's the obligation towards refugees that pushes people, for example, to donate more of their money towards these causes in the first place. It's what, for example, pushes them to social acceptance, towards, for example, accepting that they can deny certain services and jobs from you in the case that it goes against your self-interest. That was the comparative they needed to deal with. The first thing that they say is that it's unfair because wild animals have the same capacities for suffering as pets. This doesn't matter. And I'll say at the top of this clash, this is just an irrelevant point. The reason for this is that we prioritize individual self-interest, and so the capacity of an animal to suffer is inconsequential, no thank you, when it's compared to the individual consequences of us. That means, for example, that we are allowed to extend, or we are allowed to be unfair in the ways we treat different people because, for example, we have entertainment value, because we have a connection to these pets, because we take care of them. We owe a responsibility to them because we fundamentally were the caretakers for them by taking them out in the first place. These were specific obligations we held to pets that we did not hold to wild animals. That from the get-go proves a distinction. Secondly, human interests must necessarily weigh over animal welfare. That's why we don't mandate veganism in the status quo. That's why their side has never been willing to take off the trade-off. No thank you, because of how just absurd the trade-off of taking off human interests versus animal interests are. If it's about capacity of suffering, human interest clearly outweighs this. Thirdly, the capacity for suffering is symmetric because humans are also going to suffer from the fact they are causing animals to suffer by this metric. No thank you, meaning that capacity for suffering just cannot be the way you weigh this debate. The second and more important clash, therefore, is which side actually helps animals more. The first thing I want to note is this team does not take on their burden. To help animals to the extent they want to donate more towards, for example, slaughterhouses or donate more towards NGOs is not the same level as pets. Because no thank you, as I've already explained at the top of this speech, the obligation we hold to pets is so much more than that. We need to stake so much more of our individual resources towards helping them in the first place, and this necessarily must be in a way which is non-discriminatory. Secondly, this implies to you that we can co-opt a majority of their case. No thank you. Because as I already pointed out in the POI, if it's something that's of lesser cost to humans, there's likely a big push towards helping this right now, because things like climate change, for example, is important to humanity. Things like sustainability and conservation is something that most people care about, as they rightly point out in the status quo, meaning that they must defend a significant increase of this to the point in which we support pets. That's never been a path that they have been willing to cross. But lastly, we already preempted this argument from LO, because we explained to you that no thank you, fulfilling this obligation means hurting animals in the first place. It looks like surveillance and intrusion into their habitats. It looks like increasing suffering because you need to actively source out individuals who are suffering in the first place. It looks like a mass effort towards identifying these people, preventing these issues in the first place, which is likely massively destructive towards biodiversity. It's also the fact that we need to help invasive species in the first place, which is often massively destructive towards biodiversity, because an ecological balance is fundamentally upset. If we hold a balance, or we hold an obligation to every single wild animal equally, as we currently do to pets, this must extend to the ways in which we care about invasive species as well, which is fundamentally damaging towards the utility of other individuals in the wild. Therefore, taking their case at their best, we think there's a massive overreach and it's likely to harm the individuals involved as well. But the last argument, and this is the most important, is to just take the moderate case or the moderate pivot that comes out from DPM. Let's accept it's not about killing yourself, yeah, because that was never our case. It's still a massive consequence towards yourself. And I want to take this using the language that they say. Things like decreasing slaughterhouses increases cost, for example, of food, and increases cost of living, because it directly cuts into production costs when you can't concentrate them all in one area, which means that protecting animal welfare directly cuts against, for example, the prices of food. It looks like, for example, greater money donated to NGOs or greater politicians that care about animal rights taking away attention and taking away resources from the poor or from other minorities that were currently being marginalized. This team had to explain to us why the massive consequence to humanity and self weighs over the wild animals they are able to gain, even in their best case scenario. That was a trade-off that we fundamentally explained could not be taken in this round, because we do not hold any obligation towards wild animals over humans, and they never explain why humans should suffer for these marginal benefits. We'll move on, go.
So your case is hinged on moral obligation, somehow implying some invisible extent that we can apply to both pets and wild animals. Like, moral obligations do not have this implication. They just tell us to care and to help these particular animals.
Wait, okay, let me just clarify this, because this is getting very annoying. Like, when you hold an obligation to X to the same level you hold an obligation to this, it stands to reason you do the same things for this group as we currently do for the other group. And this explains to us that at the base level, ignoring everything else, the things we do for pets are things that we currently on an individual basis are willing to do because of the connection we hold for them, because of the specific reasons that we care about them. This team had to explain why this individual obligation extends to every single wild animal out there which does not receive even close to these levels of benefits in the status quo. That just means that it's not about more obligation or not about any of these things. If we just care about the base definition of the emotion and obligation to alleviate suffering, this just explains that the burden under their side is significantly larger than they're currently taking on. But even if it isn't, we explained to you that the harm towards an individual is just significantly larger than this team was willing to admit. It's the fact, for example, they are often going to build out shelters if you need to protect these animals, for example. It often takes away land from poor individuals or from farmers because it's often encroaching on the ability for these people to live. It's the fact, for example, that money that goes into conservation cannot go towards humans in the first place or cannot go towards other issues. At the end of this speech, you just need to believe two very simple things. The first is obligations, where we apply it to different groups, must apply in the same levels of behavior we treat them, which implies to you that the level of effort you must put into these people is significantly large. The second thing you need to believe is that humans just weigh over the interests of animals in this realm because we're able to protect their interests at the end of the day because there's significantly more harm by this policy than this team was willing to admit. At the end of the day, it was a zero-sum game. They argue capacity is capacity because you take away resources from other areas that you want to put in. That meant that they needed to deal with this thing be a significantly more costly and significantly more difficult endeavor for these people to take on. That meant that the bar was never fulfilled under their side. That means that this team fundamentally fails the obligation. But secondly, even if you just examine pets and wild animals fundamentally, there's a structural difference in the ways we treat these different groups of people because of the ways in which we associate connections with them. The fact that we take in pets, for example, and care for them means we often owe a specific responsibility towards them as a result. The fact that we often have care and connections towards individuals or towards these pets means that we have a structural obligation towards them to a greater extent. The gut check here is that you will not have an obligation, if you have an obligation to donate to charity, you don't have an obligation to donate to every single charity equally, but you often donate to the charities that are most proximate to you or the ones that you care about the most. This explains that even at the base level where all suffering is equal, humans should be allowed to make the decisions as to who we prioritize.
Thanks for that speech, Gabriel.
Sorry, the table's too small. Okay. I will explain why the basis of their moral obligations is untrue, but the first thing I want to do is I want to specifically illustrate what animal suffering is. It is not just eating meat. It is using them, for example, the testing of cosmetics and medicine, which permanently deform them. Or even indirectly, it is environmental damage that often displaces these individuals, destroy their habitats, and made their quality of life significantly lower. This is important because, one, let's not confuse this with natural selection. We do not obviously force animals to starve one another to save, for example, a parrot. But the important thing is that natural courses are inevitable. It's about the ways in which you harmed animals, and do we have the burden to alleviate all of the negative externalities we imposed on animals. But the second thing I want to explain is that it is, for example, excessive. So it's not just you had the need to do it. Often it is greed, it is selfishness, it is you needing to have a leather coat even if it's not substantial to your own identity or your own form of life. In the centuries of human development that is built on the suffering of animals, that is why it's not just an obligation to alleviate suffering, but it's also a form of repairing all of the harm that we have committed to the environment and to animals. The first thing I want to explain is a self-interest as a source of obligation, as they say. They give two reasons why, or rather three. The first is that there's state allocation because of access to voting. The first is that animals, it's not true the premise they say that animals didn't give up rights. Animals gave up inherent freedoms, like the freedom to mobility, for example. They are trapped up in coops, for example, without choice. So I'm just unsure as to why this is likely true. But the second thing is that voting is a very weird metric to use in general for any moral obligation. So you're saying, for example, the mentally unsound individuals who cannot vote, or children who, for example, seen as too young, significantly have less rights or obligations or just respect in society. So I'm just unsure as to why voting is the particular moral moral application or metric that they want to use, again, an immoral, rather inconsistent moral framework is still immoral. The second thing we want to explain then is sentience. So the first thing is that we do explain that they are conscious, like it is feelings of pain, etc., which means that they do feel things beyond things like survival. They might say at WIP, they only act for survival. But the important thing is people do too, and we do not discount their rights because they act in the basis of survival. So it's unsure as to why this is true. If it is about intelligence, because again, they don't even define what sentience is. If it is about intelligence, animals have shown that they are very intelligent. Monkeys can now speak the same language as people through sign language. Oftentimes, the gaps of what we know about animal intelligence increases the more that we study them because you have far more information about how their complex neural networks work. The third thing they give is proximity. One, they first have to justify your proximity is the difference, right? Like, for example, my actions and my pollution can affect, for example, someone else in Africa. I ought to be held accountable for that as well. But the second thing is that it's a scale, right? So to make one person happy, to give them meat for a year, that is 80 cows that are slaughtered and butchered. The amount of environmental damage that is caused by that, the amount of lives that are caused by that. So maybe proximity means that it is diminished, but the scale bumps it right back up because of the amount of animal lives or rights that have to be violated just for your own one person individual freedom. Let's weigh it against the obligation to be happy. First thing I want to explain is that the obligation to be happy is not absolute. And we know this, right? Because the social contract tells you that you cannot just kill people even if it makes you happy. Because there is the existence of negative obligations. That you cannot do bad things for the benefit of yourself because it infringes on the rights and freedoms that should be intrinsic to other people. But the second thing is that it's the balance of rights. So they say, oh, we have to go into like a birdhouse and snoop at a parrot while it's undressing. Like what? But the more important thing is that obviously there are ways in which you can reasonably help animals, like bring them back to their habitats, etc. This is a very insane illustration they're trying to push on us. The third thing they say is exclusivity. So the third thing I want to make is exclusivity. People can be happy without animal suffering, right? Like there are ways of protein without meat. There are ways for you to get clothes without animal suffering. So obviously that means that your obligation to be happy is not intrinsic on animal suffering, and therefore you have to prove why you should have that extra freedom instead of that necessity. The fourth thing is agency, and this is important. This film also frames it the same way as well. Agency is the precondition to access happiness. If animals do not have agency, they cannot self-determine, they cannot stay in whatever place they want to go, then obviously they don't have agency or the rights to obligation to be happy as well. If you believe that everyone should have the obligation to be happy, then it's important. Or just even the obligation to have a decent life so that you can potentially reach happiness one day. Now let's talk about the capacity to act on obligation. Go ahead. PY?
Oh, so no one's saying animals don't matter, right? But the delta here is that if your cat, for example, got hit by a car due to no fault of your own, you still have an obligation to take your cat to the vet, even if you didn't cause that suffering. You need to explain why you owe that level of obligation to wild animals as well.
Bro, when a deer jumps in front of your car, you bring the deer to the hospital as well. Like, I'm just so unsure about this illustration. Like, obviously it's on a case-to-case scenario. But the more important thing is that, like, it explains that if there's any instance where you violate on an animal's right, you have the obligation to be penalized for it. You also have the obligation to alleviate that suffering. Like, obviously it's case-to-case basis, but it's just on net still exists. So let's talk about the capacity to act on an obligation. So they say it takes too much. The first is that if everyone has contributed to animal suffering and it's distributed across 7 billion people in the world, then presumably the individual obligation is not that much. But secondly, obviously different roles exist. Like you don't have to be a volunteer. You can be, for example, a funder or a stable donor. So there's still ways in which you can reasonably act it out. And it's important. Obligations scale to your own individual capacity. So if you don't have that much individual capacity, then the obligation scales as well, already given by the poor person example at first speaker. Then they say it's about beyond individual interest. And this is why this is important. Because in order to make animals suffer, you overreached your individual interest. You overreached, for example, the basic amount of food that was given to you and you wanted to get more. So in that is true, individual interest ought not to be the metric because it's the reason as to why it harmed massive amounts of species or massive amounts of animals already. Now let's deal with the counterfactual. So first they say, so this is what's new from second speaker. They say it's the trade-off of resources. One, and this is important, you can have multiple conflicting obligations. You can be a son, you can be a friend, you can be, for example, a good student. That does not mean that the other obligation automatically cancels out. Like you can have a person with multiple obligations that exist all at once. But secondly, it is reasonable, like especially if they're talking about, for example, poor individuals. You can just stop eating meat or eating meat less because as we explained, it is scaled based on the amount of resources that you have, especially especially if they can see that you have conflicting obligations. Again, we're not explaining it has to be the most important obligation, but that obligation exists nonetheless. The next thing they say is that it's still good. So the next thing I'll explain is that it's often still good for humanity. So first thing is that oftentimes what we want, like for example, taking down slaughterhouses, helps farmers, right? It makes it that there's more food security, etc. Or for example, it helps average individuals. It stops the proliferation of very bad diseases that often led to like the worst forms of pandemics right now. So this is important because if they want to talk about self-interest, often the way that you help animals can also lead to potential self-interest in the future. So if they're willing to concede that, then we still go to the same amount of outcomes, which is to alleviate suffering in the first place. So again, there's no moral distinction. I just want to cap this off by saying that this thing needs to explain as to why the moral obligation is less. Insofar as we prove that one, the same amount of freedom you want to give your pet should be given to animals, or just the fact that if your pet's suffering, you want to stop that suffering for other individuals, even if the capacity is different, if that obligation still exists, then you're still obligated to do it, or there's a reasonable action for you to do it, even if the outcome is slightly different. So what that explains is that even if it's unequal, we're still able to win on the basis that it does exist, and that's enough. For those reasons, propose.
Thanks, let's speak off.
Animals are equal in the sense that it is arbitrary they're animals, the same way it's arbitrary that we're humans. But that does not mean that all animals are as equal as others, because the way in which we confer moral obligations is distinct from just the existence of suffering in this world. 2 points of framing. The first is that the motion states we have to alleviate suffering extends equally to wild animals as it does to pets. First point of framing, all pets are treated equally, regardless of whether you have a dog, a cat, a fish, so on and so forth. You have an obligation to treat them in the exact same way. You have to feed them when they are hungry, you have to take them to the vet when they are ill, you have to extend their life for as long as possible. This means that the motion forces them to defend treating the category of all wild animals equally. That means the invasive species that Wheeler and Cavindra talked about. You have to do things like treat pigeons as equally as you would deer or lions or viruses or frogs, so on and so forth, all of which are things that exist in the natural state of it, because this motion doesn't allow them to distinguish between types of wild animals in terms of treatment, the same way we can't distinguish between types of pets in terms of the burdens we confer on them. It's two categories, they have to apply them equally. The second piece of framing is I'm going to talk about the two types of suffering that exist in the debate, and here's why we frame theirs out. Our obligation to pets extends to two types of suffering they face. First, anthropogenic suffering, i.e. suffering that we cause them, our harm. If we neglect them and they are hungry, or if we don't close the door and they run out and get hit by a car, that's anthropogenic suffering. Or that's why, for instance, we don't want to support poor breeders because that causes them suffering in terms of our demand. Agree. The second type of suffering is natural suffering. So for instance, things like illnesses, or the illustration that Cavindra gave where they get accidentally hurt, or another dog attacks your dog and therefore they're sick. Our extension to pets derives from both these two things. This team tried to argue that we have an obligation to wild animals in terms of anthropogenic suffering, i.e. what we cause them by virtue of climate change, or that if you hit a deer with your car, you have an obligation to bring them to the vet. What they did not want to argue was about the state of natural suffering that we alleviate in pets, that we don't have a duty to alleviate in wild animals, because the unfortunate fact of reality is that nature is nasty, brutish, and short. These types of suffering predates their suffering. So for instance, a ton of animals went extinct by virtue of the ice age, or vice versa, right? Like climate change, a variety of things, predatory instincts, food chains, are all things that cause suffering in nature. We don't have an obligation to undertake this. This outframes their case. But I'm going to address their strongest push, which is on the birth lottery. So they take a very utilitarian stance. They go, if there is suffering, we ought alleviate suffering because suffering is bad. I agree, but I don't think that suffering, which is a case built on empathy, translates directly into moral obligations. Here's why the birth lottery cannot be the mechanism on which you ascribe moral obligations. The birth lottery is irrelevant because everything in life is fundamentally determined by chance. Whether an animal is one that we like, whether or not we are animals, what type of people we therefore necessarily seek to be. Therefore, moral obligations focus on the minimizing of harm, but not the eradication of harm, and that is why equal obligations never apply. So for instance, we agree that the rich have an obligation to the poor in the form that we should tax them, but we don't think the rich have an equal obligation to poor, such that we should eradicate wealth altogether. If we similarly talk about this, which is why we have an obligation to yourself. Similarly, we don't think states have an equal obligation to other states, even though it's arbitrary where states are, because insofar as you want to give things like humanitarian aid, you don't have to give it to the same extent that you spend on your own people for their medical welfare. This is because we have the duty to maintain ourselves first and foremost, because obligations drawn on the birth lottery are fundamentally arbitrary in a way that they make for impossible moral obligations. And this is where I'm going to tackle their second push, because they give you the analogy on refugees and they say, we don't have to help all refugees, we have to help some refugees. I agree. But the distinction was not in the attempt to help in a specific number, but the distinction in terms of the type of help you necessarily wanted to give. So sure, we agree. We don't have they don't have to say they help all refugees. Some refugees are enough. But the actual distinction here is between treating refugees and your people equally. And to that extent, we say that doesn't stand. Because sure, you have an obligation to give them asylum. You have an obligation to maybe keep them while the war in their country is happening. But you don't have an obligation to give them citizenship or free healthcare or education or the right to vote. This is what equal treatment necessarily means. The consequence of this is the stuff that they say that we have an obligation to have more moral ways of slaughtering animals, or that we have an obligation to conserve animals. It's a different type of thing altogether. Because I agree, but that's not what we apply to pets. When we treat our pets, we don't go, let's conserve them, let's not slaughter them. We think about feeding them, caring for them, helping them, like making them live as long lives as possible. This was the distinction you needed to make. It was not in the attempt to help in sheer quantity, but the types of help that you attempted to give. That is why they lose this clash. Before I move on to Wayne, yes?
So just to clarify, right? Like pets, like obligation is the bare minimum requirement. You are not obligated, nor are you criminalized for not bringing your pet to the vet, right? Like you just have to give it the base levels of necessity. It's good if you do it, but it's not an obligation.
Yes, you are, because it's considered neglect. It's the same way in which you have something under your hand, you don't necessarily help it, like you allow it to, say, for instance, starve to death, or you allow it to die a pretty brutal death. We believe you have a moral obligation. What they're saying is legal obligation, but legal obligation does not mean moral obligation. So here's how you should adjudicate how moral obligations arise in the round. We told you that moral obligations arose from a couple of things. I think my earlier speakers did an excellent job of explaining why you only have a moral obligation, things that make you happy. I'm going to extend on the first one that they talked about, which is a voluntary relationship of causation. The reason why you owe a duty to pets is because insofar as you keep them, they are unable to survive in other types of ways. You domesticate them, you keep them for your utility and your enjoyment, which means you undertake a voluntary relationship of care. This is the tortious duty that exists, for instance, in tort law, that determines individuals have an obligation to other individuals who keep them under their care because they have no other means of doing so. There's a big difference between the pets that you undertake to keep, or maybe even the farm animals that you domesticate, because those frankly aren't wild animals, and the wild animals that exist out there in the trillions of numbers, where their suffering is ubiquitous and constant by virtue of the state of nature, so on and so forth. Alleviation requires massive and perpetual intervention into these ecosystems. It's not about saying, let's slaughter them in less bad ways, or let's maybe conserve them. It is about treating them to the same exact degree by you treat your pets. I'm not being uncharitable, it's just the motion. Therefore, 4 pieces of weighing. The first is that they try to weigh this debate in terms of utilitarianism, but utilitarianism without constraint leads to irrational and impossible moral obligation that you necessarily have to fulfill. That's why, for instance, we think even though we like kids in general, you have more of an obligation to your kids as opposed to other kids, or your country as opposed to other countries, because if we were to determine moral obligations on suffering, and I think this is where Wheeler explains, right, that the recognition of a moral obligation is to coerce people and serve as some form of ethical guideline rather than an arbitrary standard. The impossibility of fulfilling this obligation means that it ought not exist to begin with. The second thing we told you is that we could recognize that there were anthropogenic harms to wild animals. We could recognize that perhaps we owe a duty to climate change, but what we don't owe them a duty to is to alleviate their natural suffering the way we alleviate a pet's natural suffering. Those 2 distinctions were fundamental in this round. What you ought believe at the end of this is that those obligations aren't equal. Suffering does not mean obligation. Everyone suffers. The distinction matters.
Thanks for that speech of reply.
Gov's case is premised on this idea that you can have multiple conflicting obligations, as Gov Whip says. This is just untrue though, because human beings are inherently limited in our time and capacity. So for example, if I agree to come today this week to do UADC, I have an obligation towards my team to follow through. but if I concurrently agree to go on a trip with my friends on the same week, I cannot reasonably fulfill both of these obligations due to human limitation, which is why when we determine how obligations are set out, we need to factor them on the basis of reasonableness and on the extent to which people can be expected to sacrifice in order to fulfill those obligations. Because obligations by definition come with costs. Because if there was no cost to doing something, we would probably do it already, right? Like, just think about it. Obligation, what that means, what the word means, is that through some kind of social or state coercive force, we are forcing people to do something that is against their interests, and they would naturally not be incentivized to do. Which means that there is a personal cost that we force people to bear in the process of fulfilling that obligation. So when you say people have an obligation to pay taxes, you force people to sacrifice their money in order to pay taxes. When you say that you have an obligation to let refugees in, you're forcing people to give up money in order to then house and give my facilities to those refugees. But the reason this is important is because the way by which we determine whether something is truly an obligation is by weighing the extent to which that personal cost is reasonable. And that was our claim from the start, that creating an equal obligation towards wild animals has a personal cost that is so high that therefore unreasonable. And that was where they needed to engage in this debate. Because on our side, we don't have to support indiscriminately killing all wild animals. On our side, we can still support conservation efforts insofar as it benefits human beings. Because notice that, for example, like the reason why we oppose things like cattle farming is not because we care about the cows, but it's because cows emit methane that cause climate change. The reason why we protect the pandas is not because we care about the pandas, it's because they're cute to look at and they boost tourism. So the extent of conservation we can have on our side, to the extent that it benefits human beings, is symmetric. Which meant that if you wanted to create an obligation towards wild animals, that suggested that you were supporting a level of protection given to wild animals that exceeds human selfishness, that forced people to give up something that they wouldn't otherwise be willing to give up in order to protect wild animals in a thing that they wouldn't otherwise personally benefit from. And that was the point that we made. Insofar as obligations exist to protect people, and insofar as the best obligation of the state is to protect people, we needed to create obligations only insofar as they actually benefited human beings. And that's why we have the obligation towards our pets. Because pets make us happy. Because taking care of our pets makes us happy. Because the cost of taking care of your pets is actually quite small, and therefore it wasn't an unreasonable imposition onto people. But treating wild animals the same way was just unreasonable. For the simple reason there were so many ways in which wild animals could suffer that you couldn't control of. There was so much natural suffering through the food chain, through environmental conditions that you had no control of, and therefore alleviating those suffering created massive costs. There was massively having to give up eating meat, which meant that poor farmers couldn't actually make a living and put food on the table. It meant increased conservation efforts that costed significant amounts of money. Their claim that these obligations scale with capacity doesn't make sense, because all the examples they talk about happen at the state level, and states have the capacity. But the question is how they should weigh those obligations. So if we create state obligations to protect wild animals in the same way that human beings have to protect pets, for example, that comes at the cost of states being able to protect actual people's lives, because the money that could have gone towards wild animals could have gone to people. The land that was given to wild animals now could have gone to supporting housing for underprivileged individuals. That was the human cost that we thought was unreasonable, and that was what they had to defend. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks. That speech probably applied to conclude the debate.
Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Obligations existed when we harmed these wild animals' lives. In the same way, the state has a reciprocal obligation to failures of state to stop crime that we give reparations to people. First issue. If you believe we don't benefit them, why is it important we still have an obligation? Their claim is that animals are not as important to democracy and they don't vote and therefore should not be cared for. Firstly, like refugees, poor non-voters, and stateless individuals, even if they don't vote, they in fact harm countries to some extent. We still have a broad obligation to send aid to help them, to treat them like humans, or even do things like redistribute resources when individuals themselves couldn't do so. But secondly, I'm unsure as to why wild animals are not as important. We explained to you to no response why they're important for sources of biodiversity, their importance for survival of individuals on the ground. They're literally the ones that do things like stop pollution or ensure that the natural processes of life are at least upheld, that oftentimes mean that our own survival is dependent and based on them. The second thing is happiness, that they explain we don't get happy from them. I don't know, man. Like, we're pretty happy from visiting conservatories. We're pretty happy seeing fucking Animal Planet like documentaries or watching old videos of Steve Irving. These things are equally as happy for these individuals. It's not clear as to why pets are the only ones through which you can garner things like happiness. What is the weighing for this? They have a claim that the obligation pushes people to do other things against their own selfish interests. The problem is that this fails by noting that this obligation exists alone. We have multiple obligations as explained by Riva. It's that you are a son, you are a student, you are a citizen, and oftentimes what this creates is what they've made a fake burden under our comparative to only rely on one obligation, to that sole obligation in all instances that destroys our lives. Secondly, the second claim they give is that people are harmed by this. Why? What they say is invasive species. These species thrive under their natural habitats, presumably by making conservatories you would move them towards there. Then they say you'll have overpopulation. The problem is that the harm you've committed have led to this problem of not being able to assess and control these populations, that they've done things like moved into certain urban cities and harmed the lives of individuals. It's poisoning lakes and rivers with mining residue. It's burning down forests for agricultural land or urban development. If anything, what we explain is that the obligation does is to restore animals' agency and the ways of living, and not to give them random arbitrary things like veterinarians and whatnot. That's why, and I want to note, the necessary ways in which we fulfill our obligation to domesticated pets is different, in the same way we do and treat humans. We give domesticated pets and animals vets, Medicare, working with a human system, because what we've done is literally removed their natural ability to live without human help. Wild animals, in comparison, thrive in the wild and natural processes of life, and therefore our obligation is not to do things like destroy their natural habitats even more, but rather it is to maintain these systems. And this is an important way. While obligations in their broad idea are agreeably equal, the way we individually fulfill it is different, and that's what they fail to assume under their comparative. We don't give the plaintiff medicines because that's equally as important towards them. We don't give a sick patient money. What we give them is access to medication. In fact, reparations and the reciprocality of what we give these individuals is what we do. We give domestic animals a home because you took it. In the same way that you restored the habitat you destroyed, that's the extent of the obligation that you have to uphold. Second, on capacity, we explained to you it is possible. It's conservatories, it's government anti-poaching programs, it's protecting endangered species and finding ways to genetically and scientifically keep them alive and reproduce, or even things like transparency within slaughterhouses. Maybe this is an inconvenience like they explain. This is not as big as murdering all humans. It's not eating meat. It's donating some of your money that doesn't equate to the natural death of human society versus the certainty of all of these wild animals being endangered, of dying, of clearly being much larger in scale to which they have no response other than these are less important because humans are the most important thing. But lastly, the entire government case, the opposition case, relies on the idea that we should give exact treatment to all wild animals as pets. Firstly, this is not what equal moral obligation means. When we say equal moral obligation, this compels us to do with generality what we can do to alleviate suffering. It's why capacity automatically scales with these things. They never prove that their entire premise is that equal moral obligations means a specific prescription of actions that they explain, and not why it has to manifest in these ways. What we explain is why the obligation exists, and you ought to act in the conservative ways that are equal for the capacity and what you can do. All of these reasons explained. Clearly in this debate, propose.
Thanks to that solution, everybody, for the great debate. Teams that cross the floor and leave the room. I'll call you back in around 10 minutes. Can you switch that off, please?
Oh, yeah.